There wasn't a set path, but I knew I wanted to more move sideways. Can I keep being a sports scientist? Can I find a way to do it rather than having the depth of a single team and squad that you're working with, to have that breadth across different settings and sports and athletes and practitioners that gives me a variety? Can I have the challenge of building something new? And given this landscape that we were just discussing around education and the evolution in technology, can I find a way to make an impact in that and potentially reclaim my creativity?
Jo Clubb, welcome to VALDCast.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm excited for our conversation.
Really excited to have you as well. And it's nice to do it remotely. It's a pity we couldn't be in person, but that's the reality.
Absolutely.
So Jo Clubb, the name, there's, everyone who follows Vald and has taken advantage of Vald's educational resources will associate, Jo Clubb and Global Performance Insights as such an excellent educational resource. And that's, a complete kudos to you and all the work that you've done. But for this conversation, I want to focus more on Jo Clubb, the practitioner, and everything that you've seen across your career rather than just those excellent educational resources.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Thanks for the kind words as well.
No problem at all. So with that, before we get started into, some of the questions, maybe if you want to give a quick rundown of yourself, where you've came from between your academic qualifications through your career and how that looks like, and then we'll dive in a bit deeper.
Absolutely. So I studied sport and exercise science at Loughborough University. I actually saw about sports science in Loughborough for the first time when I was 12 years old on the TV watching Tomorrow's World, an old 90s TV show. And then from that moment on, that's what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And from there, I've then worked as an applied sports scientist in team sports. So I got the opportunity after graduating from Loughborough to intern at Chelsea Football Club, and then ended up getting a full-time role and staying there for 5 or 6 years. At that point, moved on to Brighton Hove Albion, who are now in the Premier League, but actually at the time were in the Championship, and was there for a year, settling in, but then got some messages, approaches, and some interest from some teams in the US, and decided to go and work for the Buffalo Sabres in the NHL. So ice hockey, arrived in Buffalo having never watched a game of ice hockey in my life, but wanted to take that leap. Worked for them for a few years, and anyone who knows about Buffalo knows that Mr. and Mrs. Pegula own both the Sabres and the Bills currently in the NFL. So started getting to know the staff in the NFL team. That grew to doing some projects with them. Then a crazy year working across both the Sabres and the Bills at the same time and flitting between the two. And then going full-time at the Bills. I was in Buffalo in total for about 6 years, and then moved back to the UK, set up Global Performance Insights, and got into trying to be a consultant sports scientist. And I think that pretty much brings us up to today.
Perfect. No, that's a really interesting route, especially someone from the UK or even Ireland like myself. I know the struggles when you come across your ice hockey, such an alien sport, and to be able to jump in and actually work at such a high level, I think that's interesting. I think we'll jump into that first of all. From your experience, obviously going through the education system in the UK, being involved in soccer in the UK as well, and then going straight into ice hockey, what were some of the eye openers or the brow raisers?
Well, instantly I realized how much I took for granted and just assumed, because everything really up till that point had been in football. So soccer, we'll refer to it as football in this conversation. And as soon as I turned up in Buffalo and was working for the Sabres, suddenly I realized everything's on ice, which sounds obvious, but the penny dropping then of everything I know in terms of research, sports science has always been on land-based athletes, whether that's testing them, tracking training loads. So instantly I had this massive hurdle of, well, does it transfer? Can I use the knowledge from those sports in ice hockey? And that for me immediately was the benefit of moving to a different sport, which I always knew I wanted to do. It was on kind of one of my goals for my career. But the reality of actually doing that, I didn't appreciate until I was in the environment and faced with those challenges, which I overcame in time, because then you go back to your first principles, you think about the sport in terms of physiology, biomechanics, and you work out how you can translate what you know into that specific context. But the ability to do that and the critical thinking required was an important skill to develop, and certainly why I would recommend for anyone, if you get the opportunity to try and take your skill set into a different sport, to absolutely grasp that immediately.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think so. Like that experience was obviously a few years ago, but what did the what did the testing look like when you're trying to actually quantify these athletes and where they're at and how you can help them? Obviously, it may not be as granular as we have today, but what did that look like? If you can give a brief insight.
Yeah, so, well, just thinking initially, based more on kind of the tracking side of thing rather than the off ice testing, because that's also an interesting discussion, which we can come to. But it was interesting because heart rate was really well embedded, and it jumped out at me because I had come from a few years then of GPS in football, growing in attention and standing in sports science in that sport, because obviously being an indoor sport at that point, the tracking technologies hadn't quite been developed. They obviously now are at that point where we've got that external load tracking, but it was still really well embedded in terms of heart rate. Now, you can debate how useful is heart rate given it's such an intermittent sport, and perhaps some of the metrics that were being used perhaps weren't the most applicable given the nature of the sport. So again, it was juggling that positive aspect of having that technology available with perhaps the challenge that I maybe would prefer to look at this metric, but that one is really well embedded. So trying to respect the cultures and the norms, and not rush to make change and bring in my bias and what I wanted. In terms of more of the testing side of things, that's also a really interesting discussion right at this moment in ice hockey, if we actually fast forward to the present day, because I believe that on ice conditioning testing has been essentially banned potentially from the NHL, um, which is interesting turn of events, and clearly presents a challenge to practitioners. But it's not the end of the world, because obviously we now have a whole range of off ice testing that we can do. And again, that was more the priority anyway from my time, in terms of trying to assess the general physical capacities of the athletes and then work out if that prepared them suitably for the game, as opposed to trying to do it on ice, as well as that increase of data that's available within competition, within training, and how much insight you can potentially get from those kinds of streams of data to understand the capacities of your athletes, the fitness fatigue relationship, regardless of having perhaps one potential data stream removed from your toolbox.
Yeah, that's a nice insight. I think with the NHL stuff currently, it's going to be an interesting maybe couple of years because it's quite vague at the minute with what is restricted and what's allowed. And I think ultimately practitioners are going to find a way around all of these things without giving them any ideas of what to do. But I do think that if you want to be the best practitioner and you want to give your athletes the best care, you do have to have some type of insight. You do have to have some type of call it a test, call it an assessment, whatever you want to call it, but you need to understand where this athlete is and where they're trying to get to, or whatever the performance question is. So it's going to be an interesting couple of years.
I think it's in a way good timing because there has been definitely a shift, perhaps in the last few years, even across sports science, in trying to gain more insight from the training environment to try to reduce the testing burden on athletes, to try and make it more integrated experience. And so if training is testing and therefore there perhaps isn't that need for the standalone conditioning test in that sense. So I agree completely. I think the best practitioners will find suitable ways to get the information that will be beneficial within the rules that is put on them.
Yeah, for sure. So then I guess just transitioning across the city to the Bills. Let's dive into that even for just 5 minutes because NFL, one of the biggest sporting organizations in the world, and when I say biggest, I mean that across multiple different
Yeah.
aspects. What was that like?
It was genuinely incredible. I first went to one of the London games a number of years before the Buffalo opportunity came up. And I literally had no idea about the sport. And me and my friend went along, thought we'd pick it up as we went. No, that is not the sport to try and work out with no prior knowledge before you go to watch a game. So, to be honest with you, at that point, I kind of didn't get it. And I kind of, much to my disgust and embarrassment nowadays, dismissed it. Then having the incredible opportunity to step into that world and appreciate that from a sports science perspective as well, it is such a fascinating challenge. It, you are basically playing a game of chess with some of the most athletic freaks on the planet. And so I still love watching the NFL now. I'm still following the Bills. I'm hoping that this is the year that they get to that Super Bowl and get over the line. But yeah, as a practitioner, the challenge of a new sport of understanding, okay, well, we've got offense and we've got defense, but then also we've got special teams. So they have playing demands that differ based on what role they're playing in the game. And then, of course, well, it's an intermittent play-by-play sport, so how that affects everything, as well as the broader picture of times when they are training away from the facility in the off season. Then when they come during that period, there's lots of different rules about what you can and can't do. And then, let alone once you get to that competition, you get to that game day and the incredible amount of physical demands that are put on these guys. So, how can we try to capture some data that helps us to help them physically prepare for those demands and then also to recover and be ready to go in some cases within another 4 days? And part of why also I have now still such a love and a connection with that organization was because it was such a fulfilling environment for me as a practitioner, going into that kind of blank slate from a sports science perspective. But also I realized that, as we mentioned earlier, I'm coming from abroad. I don't know the sport. A sports scientist, applied sports scientist role has not existed before. Of course, there are people who apply sports science in strength and conditioning and athletic training and other medical professions, but that specific role didn't exist. the fact I'm a female, and obviously that can be highlighted in certain environments. All of that combination could have made it perhaps challenging in certain environments, and I was so welcomed and integrated into that organization by the general manager, Brandon Bean, head coach, Sean McDermott, and the playing staff, and a lot of the backroom staff who are still there, and being given that opportunity to make an impact is something I won't forget.
You brought up an interesting point there that like an applied sports scientist wasn't a thing until you showed up. So what, or I guess how did you go about that? So I've had that before as well, where you bring in a new testing mechanism, or you bring in a new concept or a new training method, and before you get any buy-in, you have to obviously educate why it's important, and you have to maybe show some quick wins to some key stakeholders. But I'm curious, how did you branch that?
Yeah, so firstly, I want to point out, of course, I'm not claiming to have introduced sports science to America or to the NFL or to Buffalo. As I mentioned before, sports science, in terms of the practices, I think is overarching across strength and conditioning and medical professions. But yes, those environments had not previously had at that specific specialist applied sports scientist role. Um, in the US, it seems to have historically been, you have your strength and conditioning role, and you have your various medical practitioner roles, and that specialist role maybe didn't exist until more recent times. I think in the UK, Australia, for example, where we have smaller populations but still want to do well in the Olympics, this is where our Institute of Sports were born out of that, and lottery and government funding went into that back in the 80s and the 90s. And that's perhaps where that more specialist applied sports scientist role started and then branched into team sports. So yeah, it was essentially a new role in both those settings, and in that role I try to be a bit of a translator, is how I describe it. I'm trying to translate both data into meaning for people. I'm trying to translate research into meaning, and I'm potentially trying to connect some of these other specialist departments with that information as well, whether that's the strength and conditioning, the coaching, the scouting, even the data science genius guys who build all the amazing dashboards and everything. So trying to translate and make it useful and meaningful for all those different groups. In terms of initially going into those environments, and as you mentioned, trying to create change, I think the biggest thing from my experience that I always say to people is, don't feel under pressure to make change. Because I know I obviously was brought in from abroad. I felt the pressure to prove myself, having come from abroad, having a visa sponsored, come from different sport. But that's the worst thing that you can do out of the gate, is try and then change everything and upset the apple cart, not learn about the sport, the culture, the history, and not take in the experience of those around you. So now I look back and always say to people, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And when you start in a role or you want to make change somewhere, that is the thing to remind yourself. And you can only start having those conversations about change once you've built up some sort of relationship based on trust. And to do that, you have to show an interest in those around you and listen and learn from their experiences first and foremost. Even though you want to jump in and make all these changes and bring in these tools or change some sort of testing protocol, absolutely take the time and show the respect to those around you, as well, of course, as the playing group themselves, because you're not going to get buy-in from your athletes until they know who you are as a person.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think I've seen this as well with especially younger practitioners, and like, I'm getting to the point now where I can't call myself a younger practitioner anymore, but I'm still young. But when they come in, they want to leave their mark and show their
Mm.
authority and show why they're there and stuff. But I think that everything you just said there in the last 5 minutes is something that every emerging practitioner should take heed of, because that in professional sport, when you get to that level, it's so cutthroat. One mistake and you could potentially never get back to that level again. So it's a one you should maybe approach with caution rather than aggression.
Yeah, and the thing that you want to bring in, the thing you want to change, there's a good chance they've tried it before. I experienced that where somewhere I wanted to bring in heart rate monitoring that wasn't in place, and actually the head of S&C was like, you know what, we really have tried that before. This is what we found logistically, culturally, and I thought, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I'm now not going to waste 6 months to a year potentially trying again and facing all those battles. Now, maybe I could have had that conversation and there'd be a certain reason why it would be worth trying again. Maybe the tool has changed, it has evolved, maybe the culture has changed. But actually, in that situation, I felt the value in his experiences, and actually in that situation, we ended up bringing in RPE instead, because actually what we wanted in terms of a solution was some internal load monitoring. And at that time, in that setting, we thought, okay, maybe heart rate currently is not going to work. Can we bring in RPE to try and get that? So again, you, as much as you want to bring in your own knowledge and your own learnings, try and take in everything from all those around you as well.
Yeah, that leads us on to my next bullet point on the screen in front of me here, but like how objective measurement has evolved over time. So this is VALDCast. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a bias towards certain technologies, and rightly so. But from your experience, Joe, if we start from even in university all the way through professional sport and what you're seeing out there now, what have you seen from an evolution point of view with technology and with even just the methods of testing?
Clearly, technology and therefore the volume of data that goes with it has evolved massively, even in the last 10 years, certainly in the last 15 years. Yeah, actually, now I think about it, I was in my intern year um, about 15, 16 years ago, which is, that's very scary that that's just dawned on me, how old that makes me as well. I'm no longer a young practitioner either, Ryan. But we were pleading with players to wear these new fangled big fat units on their back called GPS. We were, when we first had some force plates, we were, I think, spending a lot of time doing this complicated calibration setup. I remember also doing similar with like a motion capture technology and just spending ages trying to get it all set up. And now really technology has evolved so much that it's democratized access, right? Not just in sport, but as well across the sporting landscape, but also across the Gen Pop landscape. I was just having a conversation earlier today about how all these technologies are becoming available to the general population. We've seen them in private facilities, in just local gyms, in health clinics. So there's no doubt that that has changed drastically, and therefore, as a result, there is a ton of more data and different data streams that come with each. But two things I think remain vital in that landscape. One is still starting with the underpinning knowledge of what that technology is doing. And, you know, this is one of the things we collaborate on together. And one of the things I love about VALD is how much education and understanding is actually at the forefront of what they do regardless of whether someone is a client of yours or not. There's so much information and education available. So maybe not to start with the tool itself, but to start with that scientific knowledge of why you might want to use it. And then with that kind of changing landscape of this data tsunami now is that need to manage that data, and the need or the benefit perhaps of then being able to have this multivariate approach. And that's why we have multiple tools. We don't just pick one. It gives us a more holistic viewpoint of our clients or our athletes. But I think there's still quite often a bit of challenge out there with bringing those streams in together, and making sure we've got that 360 view of our various data streams.
Yeah, we've made our efforts, and we continue to make our efforts with VALD for example.
Yeah.
All Force Decks, Nordboard, Human Track, Force Frame, Smart Speed, all these products, they all feed into one area. You'll be able to get essentially an overview or that holistic picture of your athlete or of your patient in seconds, which hopefully is reducing some of that friction. But I completely agree with what you said there. It's quite overwhelming, I think, when you've got, you mentioned democratizing technology, and we're democratizing extremely sophisticated technology that even teams at the highest level do not make full use of. So you might get, 1, 2, 300 metrics from a certain test on a certain product, but you're only going to look at, a handful of those metrics, and that will change depending on the population, depending on the performance, goals that you're chasing as well. So it's certainly been an interesting challenge, but we're doing a good job, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that data overwhelm that you described there, that's been really one of the kind of triggers around what I've been doing now, or striving to do with Global Performance Insights, right? Is I try to make sports science digestible. And it's because now we have access to all these tools. So I want to help people understand why you would use them and then how to use them. And I know that's a big thing for yourself as well, Ryan. Like, your Instagram is absolute gold dust, and I go on there and learn a lot on there and get a lot of ideas on there. And so there is a need for, I think, this kind of response to that data overwhelm that we were just discussing.
Yeah, I think probably the caution point there with all of the simplifying data and making it digestible is you have to have that scientific understanding. You have to understand the bigger picture, and then you can really figure out what's important and how to simplify it, rather than just simplifying for the sake of simplifying, because then you'll miss certain key aspects of it. So, and again, I think both of us do an okay job. I don't want to inflate our ego
Can
too
always do
much.
better.
So with Global Performance Insights, you made obviously the transition full time to that consultant role. Talk to me a bit about right before that started. So when you were in sport and you were, mulling it over, and what were some of the key reasons that you wanted to move directly into that role?
Yeah, so 10 years or so ago, I wouldn't have expected to be doing this now. I definitely, when I was in team sports earlier on in my career, the only thing I wanted to do was be a performance director. And I reached a point where I had achieved my goals of working abroad, achieved goals of working in different sports. I felt pretty confident that I could be a sports scientist kind of in any setting, and I'd be pretty comfortable thanks to those opportunities in trying to make an impact. And so the clear-cut next step for me was to try and take that next step up the traditional ladder, if you like, into that management role. But the more experience I got in these various team sports, the more I saw that that role is very much a management role, where you are predominantly putting aside whatever your discipline or your specialism is a lot of the day, putting that to one side and working in a management and leadership role, whereby you are dealing with people and politics. Now there's benefits to that. Of course, I'm sure it would be a fascinating challenge, and maybe one day that is might be something that I would love the opportunity to do. But I still then felt really passionate about sports science. I still wanted to learn more myself. So I kind of, there wasn't a set path, but I knew I wanted to more move sideways. Can I keep being a sports scientist? Can I find a way to do it rather than having the depth of a single team and squad that you're working with, to have that breadth across different settings and sports and athletes and practitioners that gives me a variety? Can I have the challenge of building something new? And given this landscape that we were just discussing around education and the evolution in technology, can I find a way to make an impact in that and potentially reclaim my creativity? Because, I knew day to day what the role was in that setting, in the team sports setting by that point. And I had always, well, for since 2014 I had been writing online on a blog. That was my first boss at Chelsea was the brilliant Nick Broad, and unfortunately, Nick was such a pioneer in sports science, and unfortunately he passed away in a car accident when working in Paris. And so it was myself, Johnny Bloomfield, and David Penny, three of us who had all come together through Nick's work, started this online blog in 2014 just as a platform for sharing sports science ideas, in kind of a tribute to Nick, to keep his passion and dedication for sports science and new ideas alive. And that blog was something I kept doing regardless of the handful of people who may or may not have read it. Found it really beneficial to myself. When you're in team sports, though, to some extent, you might be slightly handcuffed. If you've got a good idea, you want to keep it in-house. And so didn't maybe have the same freedom of creativity in that sense. And I knew I enjoyed putting those ideas out there. So that also played a part in it, in knowing I'd done that for a long time, and was that something I could also expand. So those kind of melting pot of decisions or influences around variety, challenge, something new, kind of just led me to say, okay, I'm going to step out of team sports and I'm going to set something up and let's see how it goes.
Amazing. The word external teammate sort of jumps to mind for me a lot. I've worked with consultants when I've been part of a team or a backroom team, and we've brought in consultants. It's quite a trusted position to be in, to bring someone from the outside, into your bubble, effectively. Uh,
Yes.
I'm curious, how do you approach that? Because I'm sure there's, maybe not with every team or every interaction, but there's always going to be some hesitancy to share data, to share insights. But how do you go about that on those first few interactions?
So yeah, external teammate is something I've kind of, a tagline, I suppose, that I've used because it was a way to describe to people that I'm your teammate in the sense that I understand this world. I've been in the grind with you. I've been on that hamster wheel. I know what it's like to feel the pressure of the game at the weekend, or the return to play target date that you have set for an athlete. So I appreciate that context, even though I'm not there with you day by day, but actually having that distance can give me a bit more perspective that hopefully I can help you, that you can't necessarily do when you're in that crazy world and that hamster wheel. So that's kind of where that like external teammate description came from. And I think people have found it useful to understand what I'm trying to do for them, because there are other roles that are much historically more set up, if you like, as a consultant, nutritionist at times, various medical practitioners like chiropractors or even doctors come in and out. But maybe a sports science consultant has not been as common. So again, the same kind of approach as I was describing when you go into a new setting, but even more heightened now. You've got to build those relationships quicker because you're in and out, and get to know people. And again, try not to judge what they're doing. Start with observing and listening to their processes and their problems. And once that relationship is built, seeing if there's a way that you can help with that. And again, it is very different. I currently work with 3 different team sports at the moment, or different teams. One is a professional football team that I go to in person in the UK 2 days a month. One is a women's collegiate soccer team that I support remotely. And then another one is a baseball team in the US that I also support remotely. So obviously we have the difference of in-person versus remote. We have different sports. We have different levels of play, and certainly different sizes of organizations and budgets. And so again, I don't have a recipe book, or it's not maybe like an IT consultant who comes in and fixes specific problems. What I'm doing is, in a very bespoke manner, just trying to provide that additional support for the staff in each setting based on the context that they're working in.
I'm interested in that. So are there trends that you see when someone brings a sports science consultant in, especially in those team environments? Is it mainly for a one-to-one, we've got this athlete, we have to get them back, or is it more of a team-wide consultancy? Or obviously it will vary between clients, but have you seen any trends around when these performance teams feel the need to reach out to seek help from the outside?
2 big trends, I would say. One is they come through either knowing me or knowing someone in between. So I get a lot of people nowadays reaching out to me to ask to jump on a call about, because they're thinking of becoming a consultant. Unfortunately, I just genuinely cannot take all those calls because my time is precious. And as I hope those people who are becoming consultants come to learn themselves, that would be so much time I was committing, unfortunately. But the one thing I will always then point out to them, because I try and send some kind of advice over email instead, is most of my work has come through my network, which is probably unsurprising to anyone who knows the sports world. It's a people industry. Often we know that if there's a job vacancy, it's likely to go to someone that they might know, or someone they know strongly recommends. So for me as a consultant, it's the same pattern, that a lot of my work comes through knowing people, and VALD being one of them. This is the technology I've used myself for a long time. I've known Sam and those guys for a long time. So that was a great partnership from very early days. So that would definitely be a trend, being known and knowing people. So work on your network, of course, is always a piece of advice for every young sports scientist. The other one is interesting because I learned, actually, I remember in my first year of doing this that I would get really excited by the initial conversation or initial message from people. And what you don't realize initially, but you come to learn very quickly, is not all of them are going to turn into clients. So it's a funnel, right? And maybe if you have 10 conversations, maybe 5 of them have a second one, and maybe there is some discussions with 2, and maybe 1 turns into something. I know I'm making that sound quite salesy, which is the reality of it at the end of the day. But so that was really interesting for me. And actually, often the teams or clients, people I think I could help the most aren't all necessarily the ones reaching out. Those I work with, I would say, are actually already on a baseline doing a good job, potentially a really good job already, because they have that appreciation and that understanding and recognition of the importance of sports science. I know that this is my bias speaking, but yeah, so actually those that who are reaching out and are like, oh, we need to work with a sports scientist, or we think Jo could add value, are perhaps already a bit ahead of the curve. And I would say that some of the environments, without obviously knowing the details of the day to day, sometimes I do wonder if those where it could have the most impact are not those necessarily reaching out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think you made a nice point there that it feels a bit salesy, which is artificial for someone involved in sports. But the reality is, and I've seen this across Vald as well, I was previously involved in our sales department when I started my journey with Vald. It's everything is sales. No matter what, you have to, solve a problem for someone. And if you can solve a problem effectively, you're going to have a client for a long time. So that's something for practitioners, I think, to keep in mind as well, that you do have to sell yourself, but also when you're doing that, it's more than just showing how great you are. It's how you can help someone and how you can solve those problems better than maybe they can.
There's a really good book on that. It's by Daniel Pink. I don't think this is the title of the book, but he talks about the ABCs of selling. And he says about how everyone is in sales now. It's just a human thing. And actually, sales has always been about human connection. And can you bring value? And that goes back to what we were saying about the education piece of it all. Both what I do, what you do, what Val does is try to bring that value to everyone. And in doing that, indirectly at some point, you may then get some interest, some conversation, some business. But actually, that helps me sleep at night and be comfortable with selling, because I'm like, actually, I'm putting out value. And my blog has always been, free. There's not behind any paywall or anything. The YouTube channels, obviously, the videos are there. I have recently branched out for the first time into kind of paid products, and I'm thinking of doing more with it because people express an interest in being able to make that investment and get more in-depth knowledge. But still, the primarily my time is spent on putting together open access, free, valuable sports science information for the benefit of the whole community.
Yeah, that's great, and hopefully that keeps going as well. There's very limited resources out there that are as open as yours, so kudos to you.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, so I think we're with time in front of me here, we're approaching the end, but I have thrown two quick fire questions together, and I haven't told you about these, so I just want to see what the quick reaction is. But the first one is, what is the biggest pitfall that new practitioners run into that you've seen?
Trying to make things too complicated. Definitely what I see and what I emphasize with people I work with is doing the simple things well. And I think there's benefit in that, whether you're an early practitioner or a later practitioner. But I understand why the younger practitioners in our field want to show off their knowledge or show what they know. But again, if you do the simple things well, I think it puts a better foundation in place.
And then question two, what's next for sports science? What's the next big thing that's coming?
Well, it's already here. I mean, quite clearly, AI is the big topic at the moment, whether that is or so many avenues of application, but and so many debates and rabbit holes to go down. But I think, given that we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about data overwhelm and combining different data streams and all these kinds of areas, is potentially where AI is best served. And so it's here already, but I think we're going to continue to see it evolve, and a lot more debate on if, how, when we should use it, etc.
Amazing. Jo, thank you very much for your contribution to the VALDCast. If people want to reach out and they want to get in touch with you, they want to avail of some of those resources we talked about, where are the best places to do that?
Yep, so globalperformanceinsights.com. That's my website. You've got my blog on there, details of the course, links to the YouTube channel, which is also Global Performance Insights. And then I am across LinkedIn, Instagram, and X or Twitter. It's pretty easy to find me through all those links.
Amazing, Jo. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ryan.
And all of our listeners, please continue sharing, liking, following VALDCast on all your platforms, and we'll be back very soon.